Just a bit more on this Italian mafia in Australia stuff. I want to go back a bit further, look about where it's came from, just to clarify some things. An interesting fact actually, when Captain Cook first sighted Australian shores aboard the Endeavour in 1770, there were actually two Italian sailors in his crew: a New York-born guy called James Matra and another guy, Antonio Ponto, who was actually part of the landing crew, one of the first Italian, I think the very first Italian to set foot in Australia. But anyway, the Italian diaspora of the mid-19th, 20th century, it's been likened to a hemorrhage. Literal thousands upon thousands of families left Italy for opportunities abroad, to make a better life, especially families from the impoverished Mezzogiorno, the large bulk of southern Italy, but migrants settled in the North and South America, as across Europe, even in Tunisia, but many settled on Australia as their destination. Settling in Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia, communities took root in Queensland, the ACT, the Northern Territory, Western Australia as well. Tens of thousands of migrants earn their notions of a better life through their own sweat and honest hard work. Now, of course, Australia unknowingly took in a few bad apples amongst the majority. The sad fact of immigration is that sometimes the worst slip in amongst the best. But the benefits that Italian migrants brought to Australia really outweighs the deeds of a criminal minority. If you want to learn more about early contact with Australia, read the preview article on my blog. Goes into a bit, but anyway, by the 1900s and the pre-war era, more and more Italian families found homes in Australia, and especially in the farmlands. But of course, the infamous arrival of the Arte d'Italia in 1922 brought an old problem to a new country. Let's look a bit further now. Following some massive flooding events in Platy in 1951, it's estimated that nearly 2/3 of its population left for Australia, about 5,000 out of 9,000 people. Now, the contribution of Italian migrants to our culture is unignorable, and the sweat and integrity of all those that came to this country helped form what it is today. These days, I think about nearly 200,000 Australians identify as simply Italian. It's the fifth most cited ethnicity, behind Australian, English, Irish, Scottish, whatever. Just under 2% of Australians speak Italian at home. It's actually making it one of the highest spoken languages other than English in Australia. But, so anybody that wants to think that I'm just, bashing on Italians, it's really not true. It's a criminal underclass that I focus on, the 'Ndrangheta. That's a bit of early history about Italians in Australia. Next, I'm going to get into some of the early mafia activities. And you'll see there's lots of it. And, I find it interesting.
Mafia stuff. So in 1924-ish, this bloke, Vincenzo D'Agostino, would arrive in Brisbane on a ship that had sailed from Milan. D'Agostino was born around 1900-ish in Padalmi, Reggio Calabria. He was actually a baker by trade, but in any case, he travelled from Brisbane to the cane fields of far north Queensland because there was a huge amount of work available there. It attracted thousands of southern Italian migrants, and he would end up in Ingham. D'Agostino would hook up with a couple of mates like this guy, Domenico Belli, another guy called Domenico Strano. They had solid links to some Sydney and Dranghetisti. There was also this bloke, Giuseppe Buetti. This was just one of several smaller crews operating in the area at the time, so there's that. Adding to this would be Francesco Femio, alias Antonio Arena. He arrived in 1927. Femio occasionally worked as a pimp, at the time labelled a white slaver. He would become a close associate of D'Agostino and was identified in contemporary news reports as his second-in-command. A close companion of his was Stiletto Jean Morris, a very storied prostitute who had her own history. I might do a short video about her later because there's some very interesting stuff going on. The racket was simple enough, the so-called black hand letters, ubiquitous in earlier mafia history. The modus operandi is to send a threatening letter demanding money from the victim. Via the extortionate practice of the Black Hand, D'Agostino and his crew began ordering payments from fellow Italians, mostly farmers and cane field labourers. They banked on traditional fears, but they backed it up with threats of violence. If you ignored the letter, the first response would be some kind of sabotage, killing livestock, poisoning water supplies, ruining crops, etc. Further refusal would result in bodily harm. There was a string of firebombings in and around Ingham during this time linked to extortion attempts among southern Italian communities. Failing persuasion, victims would be killed as an example to others. During the years that D'Agostino was active, from the late 1920s to the mid-1930s, there was at least 11 documented murders directly linked to D'Agostino and his crew. Next video, I'll explore some of these murders and events. Love yous. Follow me for more, Mafia stuff. So, D'Agostino and his crew had spent some time terrorising the local communities. Let's look at the interesting case of Innisfail farmer Giovanni Iacona. Following arguments regarding black hand letters being delivered to people around the community, Iacona was visited by 3 members of D'Agostino's gang who arrived at his property on the 11th of February 1934. Following an altercation, he was held down by Giuseppe Parisi and Giuseppe Boetti, while Giuseppe Mamona cut off the guy's ears. Recuperating in hospital over the next 3 weeks, Iacona refused to name his attackers, and the reasoning behind this soon became clear. Upon his release from hospital, Iacona returned to his home and got his shotgun. He confronted Mamona in the main street of Innisfail and shot him dead. Arrested for the murder, Iacona came clean on everything and named Parisi and Boetti as he described his mutilation in court. Iacona received his own 16-year sentence in Bogo Road, while the others were deported back to Italy. Funnily enough, Giuseppe Parisi would actually resurface in Adelaide late in the next decade. Anyway, there were several crews operating around this time, including a Sicilian faction and some other Calabrian crews. It was never actually one big organisation like newspapers claim. Following numerous firebombings, stabbings and murders in the area, including a mutilated body that was fished out of a creek near Ingham, on the 12th of December 1936, Francesco Femio was shot dead while sleeping. This was linked to a feud between the Calabrians and the Sicilian faction led by the Silvestro brothers, Vincenzo and Filippo. Anyway, stay tuned for the wrap-up and follow me for more Mafia stuff. So wrapping up the Queensland Black Hand stuff, we're really going to follow the saga of good old V-Dags here, see how that ended for him. But for what it's worth, I'm really only skimming the surface here, If you really want to learn about the 20-odd murders, blackhanding and backstabbing that went on in the cane fields, hit up my blog at mafiainaustralia.com, all one word. Anyway, on the night of October 4th, 1932, Stiletto Jean Morris was found stabbed to death in her own home. The post-mortem revealed 35 stab wounds to her body. While it's still officially unsolved, her links to the Calabrian gangsters are shady as hell. She was believed to be involved with D'Agostino towards the end. Several reports link him to the murder. Apparently, she just knew too much. Several years later, a former officer for the Queensland Police Force would actually describe it as one of the worst scenes he'd ever encountered. In November of the same year, D'Agostino was charged with attempting to corrupt a police witness. He went to trial in February of 1933. Now, the trial was a shit show with all sorts of horrible acts brought up. Acts of violence, witness tampering, corruption, and the assault of a 13-year-old girl. Incredibly, he was acquitted of all charges, mainly because at the time, there were another 40-odd mobsters operating. So D'Agostino and his crew, they'd spent, a decade or so absolutely terrorising his fellow countrymen. But by the late 30s, he'd also become isolated. All his friends were either killed, deported, or moving interstate. On the 13th of January 1938, a bomb exploded at a bakery co-owned by D'Agostino. The explosion all but killed D'Agostino. He was gravely wounded. He would die in hospital the next day. In a somewhat racistly verbatim quote in the local papers from the time, apparently his last words were, "Mamma mia, why they do this to me?" It's kind of effed up if you think about it. But anyway, D'Agostino remains an interesting figure, one of Australia's early Ndrina leaders. He was known for being ruthless, but apparently somewhat charming. Even known to give quotes occasionally like reporters. But anyway, finally moving on, we're going to move into some later stuff, mainly the market murders next, going down to Melbourne where the next sort of activity is seen. But as always, guys, thanks for following, thanks for engaging. Always hit up my blog. It's always there, mafiainaustralia.wordpress.com. Love yous, bye.